Chaco Canyon, deep in the American Southwest. Archaeologists brushed the desert dust from something impossible. When excavations began, researchers expected to find the usual signatures of an ancient collapse. They looked for a slow decline, a gradual migration across the arid landscape in search of water. What they found instead stopped the entire scientific community cold. This was no peaceful departure. The people here did not just move on. They vanished in a sudden, terrifying instant. What really happened in those final, terrifying moments at Chaco Canyon? The answers are darker and more complex. At Echo Mysteries, we are dedicated to uncovering these forgotten truths. We take historical accuracy very seriously. Every story we explore is strictly backed by verified, reputable sources, all transparently linked in the description. But piecing together a fragmented past takes immense time, research, and effort. If you find yourself captivated, please take a moment to leave a like, share this video, and subscribe to the channel. Let us know your own theories about their disappearance in the comments. Your support is the heartbeat. It gives us the strength and motivation to keep digging deeper into the unknown. Dr. John steps into the shadow of a colossal sandstone wall. His boots crunch against the bone-dry earth. He clicks his heavy tactical flashlight. A brilliant beam of white light violently cuts through the pitch black. This is Pueblo Bonito. It sits deep within the desolate, sun-scorched expanse of Chaco Canyon. The air inside this ruin feels unnaturally cold. He stops and listens. There is no wind down here. Just the heavy weight of forgotten time. It carries the suffocating feeling of absolute silence. He sweeps the light across the meticulously crafted masonry. The sheer scale of the ancient architecture immediately overwhelms. These reinforced walls rise an astonishing 4 stories high. They hold over 600 interconnected rooms. This is an ancient, highly organized metropolis. The people who engineered this monument were the Ancestral Puebloans. They constructed massive stone and mud brick structures known as great houses. Their ambition rivaled the most celebrated builders. They hauled massive timber logs across 60 miles of harsh terrain without wheels. They did not just survive here. They thrived. They reshaped the earth to match the heavens. Beyond brute strength, they possessed a masterful understanding of the cosmos. Dr. John traces his fingers along a perfectly aligned window frame. The ancient builders designed these magnificent complexes with precision. Entire buildings were deliberately aligned with the complex cycles of the sun and the moon. They tracked the solstices. Using flawless architectural geometry, Chaco Canyon was a thriving cultural epicenter of intense astronomical worship. It was a hub of complex administration and sophisticated regional trade. This dynamic civilization completely dominated the rugged American Southwest. The cultural influence radiated outward across the vast region we now call the Four Corners. They conquered the intersection of modern-day Colorado, Utah, New Mexico, and Arizona. Tens of thousands of people thrived in this brutally harsh landscape. They tamed the hostile desert environment through sheer force of will. They carved out sprawling, perfectly straight road networks, connecting distant settlements to this central hub. Massive stone granaries overflowed with an abundance of cultivated maize. The great houses echoed constantly with the rhythmic sounds of elaborate religious ceremonies. They were at their architectural peak. They built a complex world explicitly designed to stand for millennia. They had mastered their environment completely. But here is where the physical evidence becomes deeply unsettling. You naturally expect a civilization of this magnitude to decline. You look for the slow, painful crumbling of an empire over several centuries. You expect the gradual fading of people. Dr. John stands alone in the dead center of the great plaza. He finds only a sudden, deafening void. Sometime between 1275 and 1300, the heartbeat of this metropolis simply stopped. The Ancestral Puebloans completely evaporated from the region. They abruptly abandoned their monumental, mathematically perfect architecture. They left behind the great spiritual centers they had spent generations building. They migrated south and east in a massive, synchronized exodus. The archaeological record shows a hard, incomprehensible stop here. It was an abrupt severing of a highly complex, thriving society. The meticulous tools of their daily trade were left. The tools were resting undisturbed on the ground. The great ceremonial chambers were instantly emptied of all human presence. The massive stone cities were surrendered silently to the howling desert winds. An entire advanced society walked away forever. This specific type of sudden abandonment defies all conventional logic. You do not spend decades building stone marvels to walk. The immense, sprawling walls of Chaco Canyon stood completely abandoned. The silence they left behind is not peaceful. It is the heavy, lingering, terrifying echo of a desperate flight. When you stand in the desolate landscapes, you're surrounded. The ancient timbers used to construct these massive great houses hold a secret language. It is called dendrochronology, the science of reading tree rings. Every single year, a tree adds a new layer of wood to its trunk. In years of abundant rainfall, the ring is wide. In years of crushing, desperate drought, the ring is painfully thin. It is an exact biological fingerprint of the climate. It records the environment with terrifying precision. Researchers extracted wooden cores. They extracted cores from structural beams and examined ancient trees still clinging to the arid cliffs. They aligned the patterns. They reconstructed centuries of ancient weather across the region. They were looking for clues to explain the sudden, deafening silence. They did not find a story of gentle environmental shifts. They found a biological death sentence recorded in the wood. The rings tell the story of a cataclysmic climate event starting in 1276. We call it the Great Drought. For 23 agonizing years, the sky simply stopped giving water. Picture the sprawling, meticulously cultivated fields of maize that once fed tens of thousands of people across the desert. The vibrant green stalks withered into brittle, brown dust under the relentless, scorching sun. The lifeblood rivers and essential streams slowed to a pathetic trickle. Then they vanished entirely into the deeply cracked earth. The massive stone reservoirs, built with mathematical perfection to hold millions of gallons, sat completely empty. Year after year, the critical seasonal monsoons failed to arrive. The people watched the distant horizon for dark storm clouds. The relentless heat baked the fertile soil into hardened ceramic. The wind violently stripped the topsoil away. Starvation began to creep silently through the intricately connected canyons. The carefully balanced agricultural empire was being systematically dismantled. The daily struggle for a single drop of moisture became an all-consuming nightmare. They were trapped in absolute dehydration. It is a brutal, heart-wrenching picture of ancient survival. A prolonged drought easily explains widespread famine. It explains the tragic loss of life. It explains a gradual, painful population decline, but the historical narrative fractures. Human beings are fiercely resilient. These specific people were masters of desert survival. They had survived severe droughts before. They knew how to aggressively ration. They knew how to adapt their farming techniques and weather the desert cycles. A drought naturally forces a society to relocate closer to water. It forces them to abandon failing agricultural outposts. It does not, however, force a civilization to completely evaporate from a vast territory they ruled for centuries. It absolutely does not explain the sheer, panicked speed of their sudden departure. The archaeological evidence shows abandoned tools. They abandoned priceless sacred artifacts. They even left behind heavy grinding stones and years of carefully stored provisions. You do not leave your essential survival gear behind if you are simply escaping bad weather. You take everything. You take everything you can carry to start over. A lack of rain creates widespread desperation. It creates hunger and political instability. It does not create the profound, absolute terror etched into the final days of this civilization. The climate data provides the backdrop, but it fails to explain the psychological horror of the exodus. So what really drove them out? Sand Canyon Pueblo, Colorado, hidden deep within the rugged, unforgiving wilderness of the modern American West lies a terrifying ancient crime scene. This settlement was fundamentally different from the sprawling, welcoming plazas of earlier decades built at Chaco Canyon. It was not constructed for grand astronomical worship or open regional trade. It was built for sheer, desperate survival. Sand Canyon was a heavily fortified, deeply isolated stronghold. The architecture itself radiates an undeniable, creeping sense of paranoia. The residents constructed massive, highly defensible enclosing perimeter walls. They engineered the entire complex around a secure, naturally flowing spring hidden safely inside the settlement. They deliberately restricted access to their most vital biological resource because they were actively locking themselves in. They were terrified of the outside world pressing in on them. They knew something deadly was actively roaming the arid landscape beyond their walls. They fortified their stone homes to withstand a brutal, prolonged siege. They meticulously prepared for the absolute worst-case scenario. But here is where the historical record turns to pure horror. The incredibly thick stone walls could not keep the terror out. When modern researchers first began excavating the Colorado site, they fully expected to find the usual remnants of a starving agricultural community. They anticipated finding empty granaries, abandoned farming tools, and the quiet dust of a peaceful migration. Instead, they unearthed a cataclysmic nightmare that completely defied all conventional archaeological expectations. A highly detailed forensic analysis formally published in the Journal of Anthropological Archaeology in 2014 exposed the grim, blood-soaked reality of the late 13th century. The researchers did not find carefully prepared graves or respectful ceremonial burials. They found dozens upon dozens of human skeletons haphazardly strewn across the ancient dirt. The bodies were left exactly where they dropped in their final moments. Men, women, and young children were left rotting in the open, scorching sun. This was a scene of incomprehensible, merciless carnage. The meticulously gridded archaeological dig site suddenly looked like an active homicide investigation. The physical trauma inflicted on these ancient victims was extreme, highly targeted, and intensely merciless. The bone fragments and forensic evidence reveal a staggering level of apocalyptic violence. Human skulls were violently shattered, bearing the unmistakable marks of heavy, deliberate blunt force trauma. Fragile bones were snapped, crushed, and splintered by ruthless, sweeping blows from heavy stone weapons. Entire families were slaughtered mid-stride as they died, desperately trying to sprint toward the fortified exits. The deeply sacred kivas, normally peaceful subterranean chambers, were defiled. They were instantly transformed into claustrophobic, inescapable slaughterhouses. Dozens of severely mutilated bodies were found piled heavily on the cold ceremonial floors. Skeletal limbs were found twisted in final, agonizing poses, locked in self-defense. The unknown attackers did not just want to conquer this isolated settlement. They wanted absolute, terrifying obliteration. They wanted to violently erase these specific people from the face of the earth. The violence was incredibly swift, deeply personal, and highly coordinated to prevent any escape. Yet the most chilling detail is not the violence itself. It is the deafening, permanent silence that immediately followed the slaughter. Human beings possess a need to honor dead. Even in the darkest moments of warfare, terrified survivors eventually creep back to bury their fallen loved ones. But at Sand Canyon Pueblo, absolutely no one ever returned to the scene. The shattered bodies were left exposed, to be consumed by scavenging desert animals. The deeply blood-stained courtyards were permanently surrendered to the creeping vegetation. The entire fortified, once thriving village was instantly transformed into a massive, forgotten mass tomb. The remaining survivors of this devastated region were clearly paralyzed by overwhelming fear. They were too terrified to return. They ran blindly into the unforgiving desert without ever looking back. They completely abandoned their entire ancestral homeland in a sudden state of absolute, mind-shattering panic. Because the drought didn't kill them, something else did. A localized dry spell cannot shatter a human skull. A failed harvest does not systematically massacre a terrified family inside a locked sanctuary. The extreme climate anomaly merely set the terrifying stage for a much darker, far more violent collapse. Imagine scaling a sheer, 100-foot vertical rock face just to sleep at night. You are deeply exhausted. Your muscles burn constantly from severe dehydration and malnutrition, yet you must pull your entire body weight up. This is the breathtaking modern reality of Mesa Verde. Today, it is a widely celebrated American national park. Millions of casual tourists marvel at these stunning stone ruins tucked beautifully into massive alcoves. They snap bright photos of what they safely assume was a peaceful, romanticized ancient paradise. But the tourists are entirely wrong. They are completely misreading the silent stones. Cliff Palace was never serene. It was a high-altitude, desperately constructed panic room. Picture the daily, agonizing existence of the last people. Every single drop of essential drinking water had to be hauled vertically. Heavy baskets of meager crops followed. Mothers carried crying infants tightly strapped to their fragile backs while navigating dizzying, lethal drops. Exhausted men returned from the dying plains below. They had to climb dangerously frayed, woven yucca ropes. One single, momentary slip meant an instant, catastrophic fall to the canyon floor. They lived on the precipice. They completely isolated themselves from the earth below. But here is where the architecture reveals an unsettling truth. The ancestral Puebloans did not originally live this way. For centuries, they built massive, open, welcoming cities. The sudden shift to these dangerous cliff dwellings was drastically reactionary. It was a massive, panicked retreat. These seemingly impossible structures were definitively not built for their aesthetic beauty. They were built for survival. They were heavily fortified, maximum security defensive bunkers. The people abandoned their highly accessible, sprawling regional networks entirely. They retreated upward into the most inhospitable, inaccessible crevices the earth could possibly offer them. Look closely at the incredibly restrictive, defensive geometry of these final homes. Who would willingly endure such agonizing, daily physical torture? What absolute nightmare were they desperately trying to keep out? The structural design itself screams of constant, suffocating fear. The primary entrance paths were deliberately, painfully narrowed. They specifically forced any approaching visitor to blindly crawl single file, on their bare hands and knees. This made any potential attacker instantly vulnerable to a crushing, lethal blow from above. Defensive stone towers were strategically positioned with commanding, unobstructed views of the canyon approaches. Sentinels stood watch around the clock. They were constantly, obsessively scanning the distant horizon. They were waiting in terrified silence for the brutal killers from Sand Canyon to arrive. The psychological toll of this existence must have been completely unbearable. They lived locked in a perpetual state of exhausting hypervigilance. The open, confident, thriving society of the Chaco era was completely dead. In its place was a deeply traumatized, heavily fragmented population. They were literally clinging to the rocks like frightened, hunted prey. The sweeping, sunlit public plazas were violently traded for cramped, shadowy, claustrophobic alcoves. Paranoia infected every single aspect of their daily routine. Every shifting shadow held a potential, deadly threat. Every echoing wind sounded exactly like a creeping invasion. They physically pulled up their wooden access ladders every single night. They slept trapped in the absolute darkness. They essentially imprisoned their own families within the stone just to survive the night. The towering cliff walls became their personal, self-imposed cages. They could look out over the vast, empty American Southwest, knowing they were entirely alone. They had surrendered their grand empire to the invisible terror stalking the plains. Yet, eventually, even these impenetrable, sky-high fortresses failed to provide them with enough comfort. But they didn't just run. If you are entirely consumed by overwhelming terror, your most basic biological instinct is to flee instantly. If you are being actively hunted by ruthless, unseen killers, You drop your possessions and sprint blindly into the absolute darkness. You do not stop to neatly organize your belongings. You certainly do not pause to observe deeply complex, incredibly time-consuming religious ceremonies. Yet, the physical archaeological record reveals a completely different, infinitely more chilling reality about their final hours. According to comprehensive, peer-reviewed reports published by the Smithsonian Institution in 2018, the Ancestral Puebloans did not depart in a state of disorganized, screaming chaos. Their ultimate exit was highly calculated. It was eerily methodical, and it was profoundly, incredibly bizarre. To grasp the sheer, unsettling strangeness of this event, you must first understand the deep cultural weight of the kiva. For these ancient Native American cultures, a kiva is definitely not just a simple underground gathering room. It is the absolute, beating spiritual nucleus of the entire community. It is a highly sacred, carefully constructed subterranean ceremonial chamber. It represents the literal origin point of human life emerging from the earth. It acts as a powerful, mystical portal, directly connecting the physical living world to the ancient ancestral spirits. On their very last night, the remaining survivors quietly gathered inside. They did not gather to desperately pray for rain. They did not gather to beg for salvation from their invisible enemies. They gathered to perform a permanent, terrifying ritual of ultimate closure. Picture the heavy, suffocating, smoke-filled air of that ceremony. The elders meticulously gathered their most sacred, utterly irreplaceable religious artifacts. Instead of packing these items, they left them behind. They placed them perfectly on the cold dirt floor. They arranged every single item with deliberate, mathematical precision, honoring the ancient geometry of their ancestors. Then, they did the absolute unthinkable. They intentionally took their torches and set the massive, dry wooden roof beams of their own sacred temples on fire. They stood silently in the flickering, dying orange light and watched the flames slowly consume their spiritual epicenter. They quietly climbed the long wooden access ladders out of the underground chambers for the very last time in their history. Once they stepped back above ground, the ancient ritual became even more psychologically unsettling. They moved through the sprawling complexes. With an eerie, coordinated, silent purpose, they gathered massive, incredibly heavy sandstone slabs from the surrounding environment. They physically hauled these massive rocks directly to the narrow entrances of their own homes. With painstaking, exhausting care, they mortared the heavy stones securely into place. They deliberately, permanently sealed the doorways. They meticulously filled in the small ventilation windows with thick, wet mud. They completely, systematically entombed the architecture. They sealed the burning, smoking kivas. They sealed the empty, echoing plazas. They sealed the quiet, abandoned sleeping rooms. This was absolutely not the chaotic, bloody aftermath of a sudden massacre. This was a highly orchestrated, deeply psychological farewell. The scorched timber is real. The perfectly abandoned ceremonial artifacts are real. The heavily sealed, impenetrable stone doors are real. Modern archaeologists simply stare at these deliberately blocked entrances today in absolute, chilling bewilderment. When you carefully lock a door behind you, it universally implies a fundamental, lingering hope of one day returning. But absolutely no one ever came back to reclaim these majestic, silent cities. The ancestral Puebloans simply turned their backs on the smoking ruins of their empire. They walked silently toward the southern horizon and vanished into the vast desert. They left behind a flawless, heavily fortified architectural ghost town, which leaves us with the most terrifying, unanswerable question. When you permanently mortar a thick, heavy stone slab over the absolute only exit to a room, what is your intention? Did they seal those heavy doors to keep something devastating out? Or did they seal them to lock something in? Today, the modern sun sets slowly over the desolate ruins of Chaco Canyon. Long, dark shadows stretch across the southwest. We wander through these magnificent stone plazas as casual tourists. We safely marvel at their staggering architectural genius. But the physical evidence left behind in the dirt tells a fundamentally different, apocalyptic story. An entire advanced civilization did not just quietly fade away into the history books. They were violently hunted, deeply traumatized, and ultimately driven into complete oblivion. The heavy, sealed doorways still stand guard over an ancient, blood-soaked secret. Were they destroyed by their own plunging madness? Or did a completely unknown nightmare swallow them whole?